In this video, we're going to look at what needs to be done to move on from the setup into the assessment phase. Once the students have submitted their essays, or once the deadline has been reached, we've got next to allocate these submissions. When I click on this, I'm given the list of participants in the middle. Samuel Martin, Linda O'Sullivan and dummy student. We know that both of them submitted something called My Essay, but Linda O'Sullivan didn't. So we've got two essays to allocate between these three people. And it opens up with manual allocation. And I can say that Samuel Martin is reviewed by, and I choose, we'll say Linda O'Sullivan, and that name has now appeared, and dummy student. And dummy student will be reviewed by Linda O'Sullivan and Samuel Martin. On the right hand column we've got participant is the reviewer of, so Samuel Martin is the reviewer of dummy student, and dummy student is the reviewer of Samuel Martin. And if I show all participants, we see that Linda O'Sullivan is also the reviewer of two essays here. However, it doesn't have to be that complicated. We can go for random application. We said that we were going to have each student mark 3 essays. Obviously that's not a possibility here, but we can set it up randomly for 3 essays per submission, remove the current allocations, and we have the option of participants can assess without having submitted anything. And I think, yes, Linda O'Sullivan didn't do her first part of her homework, but she should do the second. When I save changes, it takes me to this page. Some red here is just to tell me that there weren't enough essays for 3 to be given each. In the green we've got the random assignments. Dummy student is reviewer of Samuel, Linda reviewer of Samuel, and in fact the random allocation has done exactly the same thing because it's the only possible. But if you've got a large class, that will change. Now I see that allocate submissions is ticked green. There is at least one author who has not yet submitted the work. Yes, we know who that is, but we're going to switch to the next phase anyway. Now we've moved on to the assessment phase, and I want to see how this looks for dummy student. Dummy student has 1 to assess and pending 1. And here are the instructions for assessment. This is what we typed out. Here is the assignment for submission, and you notice that the author's name is visible here. That's only because while I was setting up this dummy activity for the video, I didn't go through that whole process of restricting the permissions that we looked at earlier. It's not graded yet. Let's assess it. And here is the essay, and my goodness, it looks very good to me, and there's a bibliography. Here again are the instructions for assessment, and at the bottom is your assessment by dummy student. Aspect 1. Task fulfillment, grade out of 30, plus comments. Well, at this point the students will look closely at the essay and the marking scheme and choose, and because I know which student this is, I won't have to read it, and I'll just make a few comments on how to improve, etc. Aspect 2, organisation, exactly the same thing, mark out of 20. And when all of these are done, we can save and close. When dummy student has completed their assessment, the tick becomes green, total 1, pending 0. And now they just have to wait until the teacher moves on to the next phase. As the teacher during the assessment phase, you not only get this dashboard showing where you are, you have this list of all of the students and who's done what. I can see that for the Samuel Martin essay, Linda O'Sullivan hasn't given it a grade, but Dummy Student has, and Samuel Martin has not yet given a grade to Dummy Student. The other side of the coin is that Dummy Student has not received a grade from anyone, but has given their grade. So you can keep track of who's where in the process. Once the activity's moved on to the grading evaluation phase, the student sees this. Please wait until the assessments are evaluated and the grades are calculated. I like that because it gives the impression that the teacher's doing something, whereas of course they're not. If we look at the teacher's view at this point, we see that there is something to do. When we scroll down here, there's the grading evaluation settings, and this is where we tinker with the marks. Comparison of assessments, just leave it at fair unless you fancy getting into some very complex algorithms. And then we've got the workshop grades report. Here is student Samuel Martin, who wrote my essay. It was not graded by Linda Sullivan. It was graded by a dummy student who gave it 55 out of 100 and received 20 out of 20 for their marking. The only reason they got 20 out of 20 is because there was only one student. They were perfectly on the average, and that won't happen if you have 3 students marking an essay unless it's really worth 20. Samuel Martin scored 55% and dummy student was given 83%, scored 20 out of 20 for their marking, and here's the 83% overall. Remember, this is peer marking, and I happen to know that Samuel Martin is quite an intelligent student and dummy student isn't. So I'm slightly surprised by this. I am given the option to come in. If I click on this mark, I get to see the essay again myself. I can see the grades and the comments made by dummy student. These are the grades that I'm very suspicious of. Let's imagine that we genuinely did have 3 students marking each essay. What I could do is use the assessment weight. So dummy student who I'm suspicious of, I just give them the weight 1. But if there's someone marking who I think is more likely to be closer and more accurate, I could give them a weight of 2, which means that their mark would be count for twice as much, or a mark of 10 or whatever. So you might play with that if you've got a grade you disagree with. Override grade for assessment, yes. I don't think they've graded it very well. I'm only going to give them 10 for that. Feedback for the reviewer, and I can just write something here like, I think you're being too generous in every category, and save that. Now when I look at my gradebook, I can see that that 20 has become a 10. Now that I've reduced dummy's mark for assessment, I also want to increase the mark for Samuel Martin, who I suspect has written a much better essay. And to do that, I click on the essay, and then I can read it myself. Oh, this is good. No, this is very good. I need to give it a different mark, and so I can just click on Assess, and I can fill in my own marks for that. When I've finished marking it, I might choose to make my own mark 4 times more important than dummy student's mark before I save and close. Now I see there's a new grade here, which is my teacher's correction, and I can recalculate the grades based on this. Now the essay's moved up to 66. Notice the difference between the 55 that dummy student gave and the 69 the teacher gave. Because I changed the weighting, the final result was much nearer the teacher's mark than it was the student's mark. That's what weighting does. Having adjusted the marks a little bit, let's look at our schedule again before we can close the activity. These calculate submission grades and calculate assessment grades. Don't have to be ticked green, that's all to do with the grade book and we don't have to worry about it. The marks that we have down here are the marks that the students will get in their next email. But we haven't provided a conclusion. So let's click on that and it takes us back to our first setup page. We're not interested in the general grading sessions. What we're interested in is feedback. And in feedback we have this section, conclusion. This is the message that the students will receive once the activity is closed. So we need again instructions that will help them know what to do. So to tell them first that their marks are ready, I'll make that big and blue. And then the grade for submission is for your essay and the grade for assessment is for how well you have marked the other essays. That's an explanation for what you'll see later. The student gets these two grades straight away. To see the feedback, click on your essay below under your submission. The two marks appear straight away, but the feedback doesn't appear straight away, so they need to do something extra. We could have done that at the very beginning, but doing it now is fine. Save and display. Now everything that we need ticked is ticked, and we can move to the next phase. And for the teacher, it says closed. And for the student, it says closed. But now the student has, your marks are now ready, everything we've just typed in. And here is their grade for submission, which for some reason has 2 decimal places, even though we clearly stated that we didn't want any. Here's their grade for the assessment, and we've explained those 2 marks. The feedback is on your essay below under your submission. Here's your submission. They have to click on their essay. There is their essay. And at the bottom of it, they'll be able to read all of the marks and feedback that they got from all of the other markers. I hope you can see how useful such an activity could be. It's not that it replaces us teachers, but it does give them a lot of chance to think about the quality of their work and each other's work before they submit anything to us. Let's remind ourselves of the different phases. The setup phase is what we do to prepare everything for the student. And when everything's ready, these 3 will be ticked green, and if we're doing something more complicated, all the other entries will be ticked green as well. Then when we're ready, we move on to the submission phase, and then the students are submitting their essays. When the time's up for that, we move on to the assessment phase, and that's where they are doing their corrections. And once the deadline for that has been reached, we start jiggling with the marks and calculating what we want. And finally, when we finish that, we can move on to the final section. The activity's closed and they can receive their marks. The timing is important. You want all of the students to have submitted before you move on to the assessment phase, and so it does involve organising them and probably moving this on manually. Then you want all of the assessments to be completed before you jiggle with the marks, so there's some classroom organisation involved here as well. The other feature of this is not just that it's complicated to look at, it's also very difficult to know if you're doing it right or not, and I strongly recommend having a friendly student who can give you feedback. It's not always easy to get the student's point of view, even if you're switching your role to student in the way that we've looked at. You can't always see what they're going to see, and especially for things like giving the instructions. These instructions that we typed out here, the grade for submission is for your essay. We couldn't have typed that out if we didn't know that this box appeared looking like this. And to do that, you have to have dummy students, etc. So I hope that you can follow this guide, and some of the language here is useful. That's why I've taken a bit longer and shown you the student's view as well.